Welcome to Conversations. I'm Suresh Kochatal. It has been in the works for over 3 years, and finally, it has been firmed in May this year, and now it's official. I'm talking about the British India Free Trade Agreement that was signed on last Thursday during a visit by the Indian Prime Minister Shri Narendra Modi to Britain. The deal essentially signs off a big part of the cut in tariffs on goods from textiles to whiskey to cars and allow more market access for businesses both ways. In fact, the talks on this trade pact were concluded in May after 3 years of stop and start negotiations, with both sides hastening the efforts to clinch the deal in a way that would actually prompt a tariff turmoil after President Trump started his threats. We should understand how these things work. In international diplomacy, at one time, we had the WTO, the World Trade Organization, but that was not really legally effective. In fact, ever since Britain exited the Brexit and the EU, they wanted an agreement with India. The agreement between the world's fifth and sixth largest, as they call it, in fact, we are the fourth largest actually, economies aims to increase the bilateral trade by further $34 billion by 2040. That's a big number. But when you look at the overall British economy, it's slightly small. In fact, it is Britain's biggest trade deal since it left the European Union in 2020. But its impact will be in the traction of effect of leaving the orbit of its closest trading partner. And we all know who that is. It's in India's strategic and biggest strategic partnership because we are finally signing a deal with a country that's huge. It's not that we are signing an agreement with a small country like Maldives, which we are actually planning to do. And in fact, this can provide a template for a long-mooted deal with the European Union and for talks with other regions. In fact, you know that India has been kind of negotiating with the United States for the last 3 months, ever since President Trump threatened to put in more tariffs unless the market was opened up both ways. And now that agreement is also on the sidelines, and maybe by August, September, India and US will also sign an agreement. In this case, both the sides hail the historic deal which will take effect following a ratification process, all likely within a year, after which firms such as the distiller Diageo opens up its stamp and car makers including BMW, Nissan, Aston Martin and the Tata-owned Jaguar Land Rover could benefit from lower duties in India. In fact, the question that is often asked, what happens to the Scotch whisky? Well, I'll come to that in a little while because it's not a time to say cheers entirely, but you can actually say it. In fact, British Prime Minister was very clear that the deal is big in a global era of trade, as I indicated before. Prime Minister Modi called the agreement a blueprint for our shared prosperity, highlighting how the Indian goods from textiles to jewelry and of course seafood would secure better market access in the United Kingdom. In fact, both India and UK agreed also to cover other areas. In fact, many of the items were kept pending. In fact, that will come separately, including defense and climate, and also including the efforts to strengthen the cooperation in tackling crime, which is a big thing for India because many of Indian criminals who are defaulted even on bank loans and other things are sitting in the UK, and India wants them to be dealt with. So would be the Khalistanis, which Prime Minister Modi clearly told President Starmer or Prime Minister Starmer that it has to be dealt with. This trade deal came about quickly after the Britain's new Labour government restarted negotiations in February this year. This free trade agreement also ensures reductions on 90% of UK's exports to India. India will remove or even reduce tariffs on 90% of the tariff lines, including amounting to about 92% of UK's goods exports into India by 2022, which has already happened, but it will be more than that by 2025, with 85% becoming completely duty-free within 10 years. So effectively, by say 2035, we would have most of the items out of the window, and that is including the Scotch whisky, which I spoke about earlier, which has now dropped from 75% to 75% from 150%. So you can say cheers, and that has happened immediately. So you can imagine there will be huge reduction in the Scotch whisky that flows in from UK into India. In fact, tariffs on drinks such as brandy and rum have also been reduced. In fact, it will be cut to about 110% initially, and it will settle down somewhere around 75% later. On cars, let us come to cars. India will cut its duties to 10% within 5 years, from the current levels of up to 110%. So cars will be a big thing, 10% from 110%. So British cars will be available in India at just 10% over what it's available in the UK. Of course, there will be a transportation cost and other things that will come into play, but imagine you could see Jaguar Land Rovers, which are already made in India, but you can see a lot more cars come into India from Britain. In return, Indian manufacturers will gain access to British market for electric and hybrid vehicles, and also under a quota system. And this is very, very important for Indian car manufacturers, because suddenly UK opens up, and tomorrow if you sign a deal with EU opens up. There are, of course, questions about safety standards, which many Indian car manufacturers will have to come up with to cover the European standards or even the British standards. In fact, under the current deal, 99% of India's exports to Britain will benefit from zero duties, including textiles, as I told you earlier, and Britain will have reductions up to 90% of its tariff lines. The average tariff of UK firms actually face a drop to 3% from 15%. But the projected boost to the British economic output of 4.8 billion pounds a year by 2040 is very small compared to, say, Britain's actual gross domestic product, which is in the range of 2.6 trillion pounds in 2024. So there's a lot of things to be made up to increase the deal sizes. For India, of course, the deal really provides duty-free access to nearly all of Indian exports. Huge amount of it, which is why we kind of went ahead with the UK first, because we have been telling President Trump, look, we can do this deal with you, and if you put access, if you provide kind of steps that will discourage exports to UK or US. Here we are with UK, we have done the deal, and if you stop it to US, we'll go to UK, we'll go to EU and other countries. We don't need to come to US, and that is going to be a major advantage for India. In fact, major things like, for example, even what India exports to US includes textile, leather, footwear, gems and jewelry, toys, marine products, engineering products. This is something similar to what India also sells to the UK, including auto parts and, of course, organic chemicals. All this and all put together, one thing that we'll say is that India gains enhanced access in key services, and that is very, very important for Indian software professionals and other professionals, including sectors of IT and ITES, financial and professional, educational, and of course, digital services. This is going to be a big thing, because now we have a market like the UK, which Indian companies can enter. In fact, the deal covers around 36 service subsectors under contractual service suppliers and around 16 Indian independent professional categories. So Indian IT companies can start celebrating, and even the other companies in India can really look at UK as a big market. And as I said before, the moment EU opens up, that is even bigger than this. In fact, Indian professionals working temporarily in the UK and their employers will be kind of exempt from the UK national insurance contributions for up to 3 years via the new double contribution convention. In fact, this has been a major sticking point, because you have to pay huge amounts of money as insurance, and suddenly that is kind of done away with. There is more to all this, but definitely we will look it up that in a separate video, which I'll take it up in a few days from now. We will look at sector by sector and see where and what and how the businesses can shape up. Thank you for watching. Jai Hind.